Hey, everybody. Well, I'm going to welcome our participants and everybody who's on the Zoom today. Thank you so much for joining. This is our third of our webinar series for North American Millets Alliance. We are very excited. We could not do this without the hard work of our friends at University of Missouri, at the Feast Lab, and the Center for Regenerative Agriculture. So thank you so much to Dr. Rob and Dr. Karuba and interns. You are all amazing. And for those of you who have not joined us before, my name is Joni Kinwall Moore, and I'm one of the co-founders of the North American Millets Alliance. I also work in the consumer packaged good industry, where I make foods for consumers out of millets, so we can drive consumer discovery, which is really exciting and challenging. I'm joined here today by Dr. Don Osborne and Dr. Jonathan Landick. And I don't know why Dr. Jonathan's box says Joni Kimmel Moore, but it's actually
not a bad thing.
I know last time we had like 20 of me, which is kind of a scary thought.
Right.
Yeah. And I am just so excited for our content today. We have been really traveling the world of millets through this webinar series, and it is going to be recorded so we can share it with our friends and colleagues who can't join us for the live sessions. And today we're going to be taking where Dr. Abid Chaudhry left off last time, where he took a really deep dive into the more ancient roots of millets as a food group, really millets as ancient grains. And we talked about very early migratory patterns and early domestication of millets throughout the world. Today, we're going to be taking it now into more contemporary history. And we have three incredible professors joining us to tell us about the more modern roots and modern uses of the history of millets. So we have Dr. David Baltensperger. We also have Dr. Laura Jean Lewis and Dr. Francesca Bray, all going to be giving a segment and talking about their experiences and their research pertaining to the modern history of millets in the North American food system and beyond. So welcome, and I'm going to pass the baton over to to Sophia. Sophia, would you like to cue which speaker will be coming up first? Because I know we have presentations. Thank you so much.
I don't believe that Dr. Lewis has joined yet, so would Professor Baltensperger like to go first? You okay with that?
I think we can make that go. You were going to share my screen. I just wanted to give a little brief overview because most of this I thought we would have for discussion. But a little of my background, my work on millet was mostly in Nebraska Panhandle, Northeast Colorado, Eastern Wyoming, and South Central South Dakota. Gary Whitegriff, who's on, I see his picture, Lennis Nelson, Greg Hines, and Glenn Frickle taught me most of what I know about Proso millet, and I forgot 2/3 of that. So I'm not going to pass the exam today, but it's been a fun career to work with Proso millet. I also worked a little with foxtail and teff and finger millet and a little dab with pearl millet. But my focus was running a Proso millet breeding program for that area. In that area, we all know because you're on, but millets means small seeded grain. Major millets are Proso, foxtail, pearl. Others that are grouped in that sometimes are sorghum, finger, brown top, and teff. We evaluated them all in that region. Proso is the focus. The most widely grown millet in the United States, the most widely traded millet in the world market. And it's growing throughout the high plains of the US, Eastern Russia, Northern China, some other places. A primary staple in Northern China for many years, but it's been gradually replaced by corn. Current uses are for the birdseed market, the livestock feed, poultry, hogs, cattle, mushroom production. We grow a lot of mushrooms here in Texas on Proso millet as the nutrient source because it has few other microbes on it when you dehull it. Human food as a nut, a porridge, and as steam breads and for pasta. When we look at the background, it's a 2n equals 36. but there's a fairly limited genetic work, some more recent with the new tools in molecular, comparing it to switchgrass because they're both panicums. And it's highly self-pollinated, and all current cultivars that I'm aware of are inbred lines. Advantages: grain crop that is able to produce grain with the least amount of water, can be used in emergency as a forage, and leaves water available for the next crop. It's tolerant of cool night temperatures relative to other C4 grasses and allows production at elevation. It's got a short growing season. And just an example of our trials in Western Nebraska, where we were doing a lot of different work. The season there, the thing that was most interesting about Proso millet was how short season it was. And we really used it a lot because of its short duration. Proso prices vary from $15 to $3 a bushel, and that's roughly 75 cents a kilogram to 15 cents a kilogram. Yields of 2,100 kilograms per hectare are quite normal. Market is not very deep. Early planting may hit maturity before the market is gone, and a rule of thumb is there is a premium birdseed market for 500,000 acres per year. If production is excellent or acreage higher, prices plummet because the next break is much higher priced. So we developed cropping systems, and Gary was a part of that were very important for that region to rotate with the winter wheat crop, which was the primary crop. And part of what we were seeking out were new varieties that would fit that cropping system and expand the market. So we did a lot of work looking at developing cultivars, and we released Early Bird, Sunrise, Huntsman, Horizon. And then we moved into waxy Proso, and this was to expand the acreage. Grain of waxy cereals contains a modified starch, sometimes called glutinous, but it has nothing to do with gluten. And so it's a bit of a misnomer. When you look at a rapid viscose analyzer, the big difference is in the final viscosity, but it's also a difference in setback, which really impacts its cooking qualities. The difference between waxy and normal is that waxy is 95% or higher amylopectin, whereas the normal is about 75% amylopectin and 25% amylose. We screened using potassium iodide, and the waxy types were kind of clear, the non-waxy types screened. So in other words, it's able to pick up the amylose and bind to it. Waxy Proso has the potential to expand market for Proso to 100,000 acres or more and maintain a premium. We've now started to establish a market in that region. The variety that's marketed is called Plateau. Plateau is a waxy type with yield similar to Sunrise, Huntsman, Horizon, Early Bird. Seed size slightly smaller, less than 50 days to maturity. Lodging similar to other cultivars, and short plant heights similar to Early Bird. The source of it came from a Chinese variety that only matured in the greenhouse in Western Nebraska because it is a very short day sensitive. So it started to flower around Thanksgiving, and our average frost is closer to September 15th. So it wasn't a fit, but we were able to cross it with our other types and develop one that would grow there. Future uses: primary use in human diets worldwide because of heat, short season. The US will focus on whole grain uses, diet awareness, unique breads and cereals, grain and nut energy bars, whole nut toppings for bread, muffins, etc. We see some potential to explore the antioxidants similar to what they have done with sorghum. Similar color variants in Proso should be explored for similar health benefits. If you aren't familiar, we market a variety called Onyx. I think Bill Rooney's on today, but it's a black sorghum that is high in the antioxidants and therefore used as a health cereal. Proso is well established as a niche carbohydrate. As a feed crop, it's less established, but it's higher in protein. It has better amino acid balances, or a unique amino acid balance. Better might not be the right story, but relative to corn, it's a good complement. The greatest potential is poultry, followed by swine, followed by cattle. When the prices plummet, the poultry market's what takes care of the excess, but it's slow to respond, and therefore excess production is a real problem. Proso future expansion to a major food markets beyond this will require significant market development, research, diets based on whole grains, WACA, we see specialty markets, antioxidants, and higher protein content. We have a chance to use Proso to adjust to climate change because of its extremely short growing season and its ability to produce grain with less water and its production on marginal lands. It's a really valuable crop to prevent erosion. Many of the rotations leave ground fallow and barren. Being able to grow a short season Proso crop really makes a difference. And so I hope that stimulated some ideas and thoughts, and that Gary didn't fail me too badly. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Really interesting.
And somebody can stop my share.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Lewis, can you share your screen? Do you want to see if it works?
Yeah, let me see if I can do this.
I hope you have better luck than I did.
Stick around. We may need you still.
Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Great. You want me to go ahead and just get started?
go ahead.
Perfect. Well, I just want to thank Joni, and it's nice to meet some new folks that are excited about millets. I haven't had an opportunity to really talk about millet for quite some time. I did my PhD work on pearl millets about 20 years ago at UC Davis, and I had some fun communicating with Dawn recently over the last week because we were both in Niger. He was a director for Peace Corps, but I was a Peace Corps volunteer back in the 90s, which is how I got interested in pearl millet in the first place. So when I had the opportunity to do a PhD program in biogeography, I chose to work on pearl millet as my model species. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that work and hopefully be able to provide some context for maybe why it hasn't been so easily adapted or adopted in North American production systems. So I tried to get rid of a lot of the dense genetic information in my presentation today, but I'm happy to go over that if there are questions as well. So I'm just going to talk about the origin and evolution generally of pearl millet, and then I've done extensive morphological and molecular analysis of pearl millet. I looked at 67 populations, and then a little bit just about utilization of millets and development as well. So most of you are probably familiar with the fact that pearl millet is originated in the arid zone of Saharan Africa. So just, Vavilov centers of origin are obviously not necessarily the most accurate way of looking at domestication, but it's still useful to just sort of understand these general centers of origin of our crop plants. And millet and sorghum in particular are really unique in that they were probably domesticated multiple times across this really broad range that we consider Saharan Africa. So the Sahel itself experiences really extreme seasonal and annual variability in climate. And I think that this is one of the reasons why we don't necessarily see a lot of varieties that have been developed and utilized successfully in North America, is that what works really well under these types of agricultural systems are crops that have really high yield stability rather than really high harvest index. So typically when we're looking at crops for North American systems, we have very mechanized agriculture. We have a lot of control over those agricultural systems, and we like to see crops that are very synchronous in everything that they do. They emerge at the same time, they grow at a very uniform rate. We're able to manage them in a way that is very controlled. And in most of these production systems, not only in Africa, but in India, where pearl millet is extensively cultivated as well, that's not necessarily the case. And so farmers are much more interested in yield stability, which is just the opportunity to get a yield at the end of the harvest or at the end of the growing season, rather than maximizing that yield because of the sort of instability and environmental heterogeneity that they experience in these production systems. So like I mentioned before, pearl millet, is domesticated multiple times. There's currently 3 recognized subspecies of millet. We have the pearl millet, the Pennisetum glaucum, which is the cultivated, the intermediate Stenostatium, and then the mondii, which is the wild. And I worked with all 3 of these in my program. This just shows the work that Harlan did throughout West Africa, or Africa, Sahelian Africa, looking at pearl millet populations and potential areas for domestication. And I was able to use germplasm from his expeditions in my PhD work. So reproductively, and I heard someone just mention this about Proso as well, is it's very interesting from a reproductive perspective. Pearl millet it's an obligate outcrossing species with asynchronous flowering. So it's constantly hybridizing with other varieties of millet if it's grown close to neighboring fields where they have different varieties. And this is something that we've seen farmers throughout the world that depend on millet as a subsistence crop or as one of their commercial crops. They take advantage of this routinely. So even in India, there's been studies that have shown that pearl millet growers will typically, when they save seed, they'll save seed from the edges of their fields where they know that there's been gene flow between multiple varieties. So they're really manipulating or taking advantage of this sort of evolutionary breeding that's taking place as they're cultivating millet. So it's sort of, they're not keeping it at it's so plastic, the crop is itself, that they're constantly taking advantage of that plasticity and the gene flow that's taking place between these different types. And in West Africa in particular, one of the reasons I was so interested in working in pearl millet is because farmers typically don't weed out the wild millet that spontaneously, the wild and intermediate millets that spontaneously germinate in their fields at the beginning of the rainy season. So they're actually maximizing this kind of gene flow between types rather than trying to keep each of their populations really intact and uniform. And again, I think that it's been shown that this is really a strategy to take advantage of what I was talking about earlier, this increase in yield stability. So making sure that at the end of the season, they're still able to capture some yield regardless. And that's not to say that there haven't been advanced lines developed. In my PhD work, I used several advanced lines that were developed for West Africa and India. They just hadn't been broadly adopted yet by agriculturalists. And I think it's really because they were so synchronous. Farmers were really looking for these asynchronous populations to maximize in their fields. I won't go into the domestication syndrome so much, but for anyone who has seen wild millet versus domesticated millet, it's truly astonishing to see the amount of change that has occurred in pearl millet over time, from what looks like a very, small seed head, maybe the size of your hand in length, all the way up to over 1 meter long for some of these incredible seed heads that are now in production systems. So I know that this is the year of millets, and I don't think this is the month of pearl millet, but There's several different crops that are also associated with millets, not all of these, but teff, sorghum, finger millet, skinny millet, and so forth. So, millets are native to Asia and Africa. And so it's exciting to be able to work with these cereals, particularly in African production systems. But I was able to grow out all of these populations in Davis, California, which is right around 38 degrees north latitude. And even with the photoperiod sensitivity, I was able to get great yields on all of the populations that I worked with. So I worked with wild, intermediate, landrace, and advanced lines. And I got every single one of them to not only flower, but produce abundant amounts of seed. So like I said, I used 67 different accessions. I was able to acquire most of them through Georgia with their millet, with the USDA germplasm system that they have there in Griffin. And then I was able to also get some of Jack Harlan's original populations as well to look at in my work. So I was really looking at these general descriptions of each trait for each type. I was interested in how much integration or hybridization was taking place between these populations. And like I said, I really feel like this was a strategy that farmers in Africa, and it's also been documented in India, were taking advantage of. And one of the reasons why there's so much, not only variation, but I hate to say distrust of these new varieties, is also how seed networks form throughout much of the world. So it's been really well documented that for millet production systems in West Africa, if you're looking for seed, you're most likely to go to someone within your family first to find that seed. Then you're going to go to maybe a neighbor in your community. You're going to keep it all really close within your community. And the very last person that you're going to go to is an extension agent to potentially get some new varieties or populations to experiment with as a farmer, which is depressing for me to think about because I spent the last 12 years of my life as an extension specialist, but it's true. It's just not the way that these seed networks typically work. And so what I was really interested in is how much hybridization was taking place in farmers' fields, and also the amount of gene flow that was taking place between these wild and intermediate types. So these are the countries that I studied, that I had populations from. The highest number of populations came from Niger, and then I used some control populations from Kenya and Zimbabwe. And this just shows some of the millet that I had growing in California. These two types on your left-hand side are both land races, although the one on the right looks much more wild, but it is still considered a land race. And then you can just see the multiple tillering that takes place as well. With the advanced lines that I was growing, they looked much more like maize or corn, where you had just one primary tiller. They were very short. And they were very uniform in terms of their growth. So very synchronous. There wasn't a lot of variability between the 32 traits or so that I studied in the field. But they were also not being utilized in Africa and in African and Indian agricultural systems. So like I said, millet typically follows a domestication syndrome model, but there were exceptions, with plant height and spike length being most diverse within landrace types rather than in the non-domesticated types. So typically we see the most diversity or the most variation in the wild types, but in this case, we actually I saw a lot of variation still in the domesticated populations, which just demonstrated that there was a lot of hybridization going on. I also did molecular analysis using microsatellites. I used 14 microsatellites. I used express sequence tags as well that were derived and specifically targeted areas of the genome, known areas of the genome. And so I was, again, looking at this level of molecular diversity within these non-domesticated land races and advanced lines. And you can see here, this just shows a farmer's field in Mali, West Africa, where you have land races maturing with non-domesticated plants. And so again, this is one of the ways that cultivation takes place in areas where millets are indigenous. And so how do we translate that to North American systems, or systems where we have highly mechanized and controlled agriculture taking place? even something like fertilizing a field where you're looking at using advanced cultivars can be very problematic and cause massive growth, lodging, and all sorts of other problems. I was growing the millet in Davis, California, without even modifying or amending the soil there at the UC Davis Research Farms, because it had been amended so many times over the years for all of the different experiments going on, that I knew if I amended it, I would end up with 20-foot millet that would all just lodge. And I saw this time and again with other folks that were working with land races, where if you over amended the soils, you had horrible problems. So I think that's also something to take into consideration, when we look at all of these different crops, especially ones that have been developed with Green Revolution technologies. Millet doesn't really fit into that so much. And it's one of those crops that we're blessed with because it can grow with very little precipitation and very little need to amend the soil. But I think that becomes tricky when we're trying to adopt these varieties or cultivars to North American systems, where that's been our habit all along. So I just want to acknowledge the folks that helped me with some of this. I was an NSF graduate research fellow when I was at Davis, so I had a lot of really great funding to be able to do this work. I'm happy to provide references as well. And I just love this quote that we just continue to see variation take place under cultivation. And I think millet is one of the most magical crops because it continues to undergo just incredible amounts of diversification, even as it's being cultivated. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so great.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lewis. That was a wonderful presentation. Dr. Bray, would you like to try sharing your screen?
I'll try doing that. Is that okay? Okay, so thank you very much for having me here. I'm not a plant scientist, I'm a historian, and I'm going to try and root the present in the past in a rather different way from the people who've already spoken, though I learned a great deal from their presentations. So what I want to do is talk about millets in China. And millets in China used to be the principal staple crop. They almost disappeared in the 1940s and through to the 1980s, and they are now making a comeback. So, oh God. So, so this is a series of advertisements for online sales of millet from the Taobao platform, just one of the many online platforms that sells all kinds of things to people in China these days. And these, as you can see, are mostly foxtail millet. I was very interested when I saw these adverts because I thought nobody ate millet in China anymore. And I'm a historian of food and agriculture in China, and it was a real surprise to me to see that millet was coming back again. If you look at ancient, well, not all that ancient, if you look at books of agriculture or botany in China, they show you that the two main types of millet grown are Soteria, foxtail millet, and the panicum, which we usually call broomcorn millet in that part of the world. This is a non-glutinous one that is being shown here. And this is Liang, which is a especially good variety of Soteria. And these are two crops that were domesticated in China a very long time ago, probably about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. They were absolutely suited to the climate of North China, which is quite arid, has very harsh winters and a little rain in the summer. So these were spring crops that grew in the warm season. And as we've already heard, they grow fast. They are harvested within the season. And they can have astonishingly large heads and yields for such scrawny little plants. So here is a picture from the 4th century CE of the farming system of North China in which millets were grown. And this is a picture of the manorial system. So these were large estates growing millet, usually in quite small fields, but using animal fertilizer and producing the surpluses of millet that actually provided the sustenance not only of the population, but also of the imperial state of China. And during that period, many farming treatises were written which describe in very dense and accurate technical detail how these crops were grown, how they were marketed, what the yields were likely to be, what the sowing rates should be, and so on. And these were the center of a very elaborated agricultural system, which was also remarkable for its fruits, its vegetables, its livestock raising, and so on. And this continued to be the main system of agriculture in North China for a very long period. And because North China was actually the breadbasket of China until about 1000 BC, it was the crop of China, not rice. But round about 1000 BC, for various reasons, including invasions from the north, the southern rice lands became the principal crop of the Chinese state exchequers, the principal crop that people were worried about. They suddenly start writing agricultural treatises about rice, and millet carries on, but it's no longer the center of attention that it used to be. However, it is still grown, and it is still important in North China, even though it is rivaled by wheat, which rich people preferred. Millet has considerable value, especially Ceterium millet, because it keeps a long time. So you can store it in these underground pits, which invaders will not know about, and it will keep for up to 10 years without spoiling if the water doesn't get in, so the pits were carefully made. So through the imperial period, millet continued to be an important crop, not least ritually and symbolically, even if rice was more important economically and in terms of absolute quantity. Millet remained a sign of good imperial rule, somebody who could provide enough staple food, which was the millet that was celebrated at the altars of the gods of soil and earth. The millet that you see here in this auspicious signs painting was still very important symbolically in China. And it was also still very important for supporting the armies in the north, which was China's most vulnerable region. So in military terms, millet continued to be important. However, it was a food that was eaten by soldiers and poor people rather than by the rich. It wasn't a crop in which the Chinese government invested in the early 20th century, when plant science became one of the patriotic endeavors of Republican China. At that point, wheat and rice were the crops in which research was poured, and millets became what they call an orphan crop. They continued to carry on in poor regions, however, until the revolution and the establishment of the communist state. And at that point, particularly from the 1960s, maize was adopted as a crop that had immensely high yields compared to anything else that was grown in China, even rice. But maize rivaled millet because it grew on the same kind of land, and it yielded far more. And you were expected to produce certain amounts according to your contract with the government, and people abandoned millets in favor of maize. And then later on, when the economy improved, many people actually preferred to eat rice. So you can see here how the actual area grown to millets almost disappeared by 2014. In some areas of China, however, millets continued to be grown, And this is the Taihang Range, which is a very poor, barren area up in the hills of North China. Not quite the Sahel, but really pretty difficult place to make a living. And it was an area that was really backward in economic terms until quite recently. One of the regions which started growing millets again in the 2000s, really quite recently, was this community called Wangjinzhuang, which is extremely poor and which built these magnificent terraces, basically with their hands and their shovels in the Maoist period. And originally these were mostly grown with maize. But just recently, there has been a huge movement in China, because it is such a prosperous nation, towards heritage foods. And people rediscovered millet as a heritage food. Meanwhile, under Xi Jinping's ecological civilization, scientists are looking for crops that will be adapted to climate change. And that, together with better transport and sales on the internet, has allowed farmers in Wangjinzhuang to change from maize back to millet and to start marketing it on the internet, along with other crops that they grow locally, like Sichuan pepper. So here is a picture of somebody with their donkey and a plow, which could have come out of the mural that I showed you earlier. But this guy on the right, who is harvesting millet with a sickle, which could have been made 3,000 years ago, he is an IT engineer. He's a local boy who made good in IT engineering, set up a firm, decided that he had to come back to the land of his fathers and help the peasants improve their lives. And so now he works as part of the local cooperative on the IT marketing strategies to sell the kind of millet I was showing you in the first slide, which is packaged as grown by peasant farmers using donkey manure, which 10 years ago would not have been a very good way to sell anything, but now has become a romantic attraction for many urban Chinese. Meanwhile, about 100 miles away across the mountains, another equally poor and barren area called Qinzhou has also been starting to become rich with millet. But Qinzhou are doing it entirely differently. They don't have beautiful terraces. They're not a tourist destination. They are experimenting with scientifically bred hybridized millets, and they make most of their money not from direct sales, but from the value added in processing. And so one of the things that they process is this tin on the right, which is called love of millet, guaizhi. And it's a baby food. And this is drawing on the traditional qualities of millet as being something which is supposed to be extremely nourishing compared to other crops, and in particular maize. So just briefly, since I see that my time is up, here you have two very, very different ways of reviving an ancient crop in China, both of which are attracting considerable attention from rural economists and agricultural scientists as a way in which they hope that they can build a better future for millets in China. But as with the United States, the problem is you have to persuade people to eat them. So thank you for your attention.
That was fascinating, Dr. Braid. Thank you to all of our presenters. I feel like this has given us a really interesting look into where we are today and why we're so passionate about driving demand on the consumer side to build up these modern markets to support the renaissance of these small cereals that are so significant from a historical perspective, nutritional perspective, and now for a regenerative and soil-focused agricultural future. So I wanted to open it up to questions. And Sophia, are you back? I know Sophia had to step out for just a moment, and wanted to open up to questions. I can see the chat, but I don't think I can see the questions. because of my permission. So if anybody has a question for the presenters, oh, I see Sophia's back, or just raise your hand using the little reaction emoji on your Zoom screen, and that will show a raised hand, and we can call on you and you can ask a question of the group.
I think everybody should be able to see the chat since it's
Okay.
just a meeting format, but I don't think anybody has said
Perfect.
any questions.
All right, perfect. Okay, anyone out there have a question?
I had a little question. I think it was with Dr. Baltensperger's presentation. This thing about waxy and non-waxy, I don't quite understand that, or the advantages and the disadvantages. Could you explain that a little bit more?
I'm glad you asked that, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do either, but they make different quality cooking. So the type that we use that has the waxy, the normal wild type in the United States and the birdseed market, et cetera, is not what they use for cooking food in Japan. They make specialty cakes in Japan for celebrations like birthdays and things like that, where they use the glutinous type. There are other things, I would say it's a stickier product, and therefore it works better with chopsticks in my blunt terminology. So that is the core difference. And for the food market, our primary export market has been Japan.
I see.
It's a culture. They don't grow much there, but it's a culturally treat that is part of their native cuisine there. And as far as finding the true advantages, that's where I talked about the research. You know, when you have a specialty starch, and we have waxy corns and we have waxy sorghums and different things, they talk about multiple uses for those different starch types and what do they break down better to make ethanol and things like that. Well, those are all kind of theoretical. The small market we were after was a human food market.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fascinating, because I've had multiple buyers out of Korea and Japan and even Taiwan specifically request waxy varieties. And I went back to my farmers and they actually didn't know the difference.
So when they first came to us, they called it gluten. And we were going, millet doesn't have gluten in it. We don't even know what you're talking. Well, 10 translators later, we did figure that out. And we started a long-term project with them. And that's what led to the identification of waxy types that came out of Chinese germplasm in our germplasm collection. So, but it was adapted to southern Japan.
It's kind of analogous, I think, to sticky rice. There's whatever the chemistry better than I do, but I think one protein shorter or something like that. But I actually have a slow cooker downstairs with glutinous or waxy, if you will, proso and black lentils in it. I think that form of grain is a little better for like a congee, but it also like with sticky. I don't know if there's a sticky millet confections like there are sticky rice, but it will literally, the grains once they're cooked will stick to each other. And yes, the glutinous and not new gluten. It's just a small vowel change for those of us.
Yeah, just a little one letter.
Right, but I would, since I've got the floor for a second, I would just mention, following up on Professor Bray's presentation, that I have had occasion to frequent ethnic markets specializing in East Asian and also South Asian foods, and I regularly will check the aisle with millets, and there's all kinds of like different varieties, and even gift packages with foxtail millet. And they don't always, the USDA does not have a good labeling system, so you don't know what kind of millet it is. But by looking at it and then reading the Chinese, which I can do just a very little bit, you can figure out which it is. But yeah, even in gift packages, different kind of like white mixed, white, yellow, red, black foxtail millet in these kind of mixes. It's quite fascinating to see. I put some pictures up on a Pinterest site, and I'll add to those pictures and give link in the chat. A quick question also, if I could, for a comment regarding Dr. Lewis's presentation. In Gao in Mali in 2000, I learned of seed fairs that the FAO sponsored as part of a program in which they paid for villages to build kind of a storehouses for their varieties of millets. And what happened in these seed fairs that was quite amazing is that farmers from villages that were not that far from each other saw what each other were growing. And in a number of cases, apparently, there were farmers in some villages that found varieties of millet they thought were lost, because that region had gone through a number of severe droughts. And literally there were crop failures and people lost their seed sources. So it was very interesting that to me anyway, that they had identifiable local named varieties that had characteristics of longer or shorter season or other factors. And they knew these by name in the Songhay language that happened to be there. So it's quite a fascinating aspect. Anyway, sorry, others will have questions.
Right. Nana Meyer had a question for Laura, and Laura answered it. The question was, and I'm so glad it's kind of a similar question I had. Pearl millet happens to be the millet I've eaten so much of, and it's very addictive in terms of its sweetness. And the smell of it is just very attractive. And I was always hoping that we could develop it in the U.S. But the question is, who's doing the millet research right now in the U.S.? And are there some prospects for access to pearl millet for U.S. consumers? And there's an answer, but maybe Laura Jean, you could respond to that verbally.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry I haven't kept up. I haven't been is involved. I was still doing research on millet when I was at the University of Maryland about 10 years ago. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been more of a generalist working on food systems programs in Washington State. So I'm not entirely sure nationally. I'm assuming that Georgia, and it looks like Esther did mention some seeds of pearl millet from Tifton that they're doing an evaluation on this year in Wisconsin. And then I know Kevin Murphy has been working on millets at WSU, really depending on funding sources and graduate student interest. So that has been an area of research within Washington State University.
If I can add, people are working in Iowa State as well. Basic level, it's still we're looking for some grants, but they have started this crossing programs and evaluating all those accessions now in millets. So,
well, there's
and I actually still have. Oh, I was going to say I just came across it. It was kind of serendipitous that I was asked to join this group for this talk. I just came across the 2 boxes of all the seed from my dissertation work, from all the millet that I grew. I kept seed from all those lines as well. And obviously it's not going to be true to type from the original accession populations that I acquired, but I'd be happy to share that if people were interested in that as well. Maybe I'll ship it off to Joni and then she can figure out what to do with it.
There's been a good deal of pearl millet work at Nebraska over the years. We released a hybrid out of there, and Dave Andrews and I did. And then there's been follow-up since then out of Nebraska, but it's never taken off as a crop. I mean, the only pearl millet that I'm aware of being grown at all are forage types, where they're growing for forage. And most of those trace to Wayne Hanna's program out of Tifton. And he hasn't done any breeding on them for a lot of years, but there's still some of those hybrids that various seed companies have on the market. And some of them might trace to Dave Andrews' program, and some of them might trace to a K-State program, but they're really pretty minor efforts in breeding today as to full scale year-over-year breeding programs. And not much from the companies. Some of them are bringing material in from other locations where they have hybrids and marketing them as forage hybrids. But really the only millet that's being grown in the United States right now for our Proso, and foxtail. You can find a few acres of teff in Kansas and Nebraska, but it's a few acres. It's kind of like an oversized garden that are going into some of the Indian bread markets.
Okay, interesting.
This is Gary. Dr. Baltensperger, you brought up the issue of oversupply, and that's how I got in the millet business 45 years ago. It's still an issue with every type of millet in the US, not only excess Proso. There is no price protection for anybody that grows any kind of seed, including pearl, foxtails. There are growers in the US that grow Japanese and other millets, but they're taking all the risk. There's no price protection, or and in most cases, no crop insurance. And so anybody have any suggestions on how to resolve that long-term issue? I think all growers are interested. One thing that you did bring up, and I'll address some research I did or was involved in 20 some years ago, was waxy millets seem to have a more fit in the ethanol market. And just like excess corn, ethanol pulled off that excess supply over time and in effect stabilize the price of corn. And that is a possibility to not rely just on poultry feed or feed markets, but also as a pull off into the ethanol production.
Yeah, but even ethanol is a price decrease from the premium markets that are really driving the acreage. For whatever reason, people pay a lot of money for birdseed. I mean, the fact is most of the Proso millet goes out as birdseed in the US, and most of it, I mean, it's a little over a $3 billion industry now. You walk into every big box store in the country and there's shelf space dedicated to birdseed, and they don't dedicate shelf space if it doesn't make money. So it is a major crop. We grew almost 750,000 acres last year. I assume that means the price will go down according to Gary and my charts.
Until you pull it off with exports, and again, that's how I got into it. Back in 1978, the price was 0.00 for millet in South Africa, and I was able to arrange some exports to Europe, basically competing with Argentine Yellow Plata, and that established a base price for U.S. millets. And so you could say, rather than bird food paying the premium, bird food buyers are always looking for the cheapest price, like any commodity. And then you have to pull off supplies in order to drive that back up. And that's why I'm looking at having something like ethanol or feed being a base price, whatever that is, 8 cents a pound, 7 cents a pound, to pull off excess supplies when needed.
Great. Don, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I put that up in the chat, but basically I was looking at the history of millets in the US, which is relatively short, but I understand that there was a boom in foxtail millet production in the very late 1800s and just into the 1900s. I wondered if there's any background on why that was, what it was used for, and then why it dropped off, why it happened and why it dropped off.
If you look at that time period, we were a horse and cattle powered farm economy. And so it was used, foxtail was used primarily as a forage, and they grew enough seed to put it into the forage supply. And if they had some extra grain, they fed it to hogs. Thus they call, that role. But as we transition to a power economy with less forage, like oats, like a lot of other forages, the acreage really decreased. Then in the mid 50s, foxtail millet even became scarcer because it was tied to wheat streak mosaic as an alternate host. And because most of the region was dependent upon a wheat fallow crop, and they were only interspersing these summer annuals occasionally, it became a real problem to have foxtail millet as an alternate host that carried it over the summer. Proso millet seems to be quite resistant and not have either the insect that transmits it or the virus itself. And so foxtail, some varieties are worse than others, and we screen for resistance, but it already developed such a reputation that it's hard to break that mindset that you can't grow it. But we did identify some highly resistant foxtail varieties, but that had a real impact on the acreage of foxtail in the 60s and 70s. Okay.
I want to mention all that in the late 1800s, you got to remember the plain states were just being settled. And like my ground was homestead in 1884. So a lot of the ground was just being broken. And a lot of the settlers were European based, bringing in short season crops that they could produce a food and produce grain, because they were raising poultry, they were raising hogs, although Proso tended to go for hogs for feed. The foxtail millets tend to be quite high in oil and can make animals kind of, well, too loose, but it's very, very palatable. And so as they started stabilizing production with wheat, I think we've seen the phase out of the foxtail millets, as well as in the later on in the century, mid-century, as the horse was replaced by tractor, you had less and less need for that feed.
Looks like
That's super fascinating.
Yeah, really. Geez, I mean, we really.
This is a good discussion.
Well,
Shall we think
All
about?
right.
It's been a lot of fun to get back and think about millets just a little bit. I should share that I think he's been participatory in some of them, but Deepak Santra took over the position that I was in Nebraska. He still runs a very vigorous millet program and actually helped push Plateau and has continued to work with waxy Proso. I think a little less with the foxtails, but part of what we were developing was the world of color, because we discovered that even though birds are colorblind, the people who buy bird seed aren't, and they like to layer their clear glass bird feeders with red and white or orange and white, depending on their favorite team. And so we developed a lot of different color types to fit that market niche, but it's really a niche crop at this stage.
Well, it's fantastic. You guys, this has been great. I know we're over the hour and I kind of hate to stop this fantastic conversation, but I have to go pick up my daughter from school. So I'm going to have to excuse myself, but I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who has supported us through this. Thank you to our speakers today. Laura, it was fantastic to see you. It's been too long. And I learned a lot, which is always the greatest thing about these webinars is the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So I'm so happy to have solved that riddle about the waxy or glutinous sorghums. I cannot wait to call my Korean brokers and tell them what I learned today.
Take care.
Thanks so much, you guys. Take care.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.